Let's take this thing off, which is nice. Okay. So today we are continuing on our series. We are looking at this year, for a fair bit of this year, we've been looking at a series, Understanding Prophecy and what prophecy is all about. And the better we understand what prophecy says to us, the better we understand the world around us. But remember, we're not just wanting to say, this is this is a prophecy, this is the interpretation of the prophecy. We're wanting to go back to first principles and understand how prophecy works, what some of the principles behind prophecy are, and also to help us so that you don't just learn what a prophecy is interpretation, but you can determine that interpretation for yourself. Okay, so we want to understand that first principle. Today we're going to start diving in, as I said, to apocalyptic prophecy, what we call apocalyptic prophecy. And apocalyptic prophecy is one of those things that is really misunderstood sometimes. That word, when you hear that word apocalypse, or you hear that word apocalyptic, what's often the thoughts that come to your mind when you hear the word apocalypse? When you hear the word apocalypse, what's often the word that comes to mind? Or the thought? What's the image that comes to your mind? The things that happen at the end of time. Yep. So often people think about, when people use the word apocalyptic, or they use the term apocalypse, they use it to refer to the end of time, don't they? Right, we'll go back a couple of slides. So the end is near. The end is near. People think about the end being upon us. But if you remember from last time, we were talking a little bit about the different ways that people interpret prophecies about the future. Okay? We talked about how some people apply prophecies all to the past, some people apply prophecies all to the future, but we don't need to understand that the prophecies God gives us go right throughout time. They're being fulfilled right throughout time. It gives us like a timeline of Earth's history. But today I'm going to actually go and introduce the apocalyptic prophecies of Daniel. So we're going to spend a few sessions, a few weeks, just looking at the prophecies of Daniel, but rather than just looking at what the prophecies are and the interpretation, we also want to give a bit of an overview so that we can all understand them better and how we can interpret them properly. But the first thing we really need to understand is we need to understand what an apocalypse is. We have a problem. Yeah. Okay. We might need to just do that. We could also use a phone to hook onto the same Zoom meeting and use that one. Okay. Is it coming through my computer? Yeah. Oh, okay. If you're using just the computer, it won't have a picture. So we might just need to have the sound today. Alright, well, technical difficulties, that's right. We're trying to make it possible for everyone to join us by Zoom as well, but maybe they'll just have to, maybe if you screen share. Screen share would be good because then they can see what's on the screen. So that would be a good idea. Okay, so today we're looking at the prophecies of Daniel, giving a bit of an overview, understand what apocalypse is. Often people think apocalypse is just the end of the world, but we need to understand what the original definition of apocalypse is, and what apocalyptic prophecy is. One definition of apocalyptic prophecy is this. It's a term derived from a Greek word meaning revelation. And you've heard that term before, haven't you? The book of Revelation. In fact, in the Greek, it's not the book of Revelation, it's the apocalypse in Greek. So, apocalypse is a term derived from the Greek word meaning revelation. and it's used to refer to a pattern of thought and to a form of literature, both dealing with future judgment. Okay, so that's one definition we have. It is a form of literature, okay, dealing with future judgment, telling about future judgment. That's to define what apocalypse is. So we are correct in a way. It is about the future. It's just to help us to understand what's happening in the future. But if we want to understand it even better, we need to look at the original Greek word. When we look at the original Greek word, the original Greek word is apocalypsis. Apocalypsis, and that word apocalypsis it's a compound word. A compound word is a word that's made up of two words put together. Now, for those that speak German, you would be very, very familiar with compound words. Germans love it. And the thing, though, that's really interesting I find in German is that when they have a compound word, they take two words, they stick them together, but the word that they've created by sticking those two words together doesn't actually necessarily mean what those two words mean individually. Is that correct? Right? They have a whole different meaning of its own. Okay? You could take the actual definition of those two words. A good example of that was during World War II. Hitler had a phrase about one of his policies, which was Lebensraum. And Lebensraum in German, if you take the two words together, it means love house. Leben, love. Leben. Yep. So Leben is love. Straum is house, isn't it? Or something like that. Home. What was that? Straum. Straum. Oh, it's green. Okay, so green. Okay, so, you know, a dream of love or whatever else. But what he used it to mean was creating space for the German people to thrive. Right? He talked about it in that sense. So it's one of those things that's confusing. You look at the two words on their own, but when they're combined together, they can have another meaning. So there's lots of languages that actually do this, and Greek is one of those languages that has compound words. They take two words, they put them together, and creates a new term. And apocalypsis is a compound word. Okay, it takes two Greek words. So apo, which means from, apo means from, and kalypsis means cover, to cover, or something that is covered. Okay. So if you take it from a literal sense, apocalypsis means from cover. Something coming, another way of putting it is something coming out of cover. Okay, something coming out of cover. So it's unveiling something which is hidden, unveiling something which is hidden. So our children's story example of apocalypse, because I was presenting objects to the kids that were covered. You looked at it and you sort of thought you knew what it was, but it's not until you uncovered it that you could see it clearly. So that's what apocalypse is. My children's story, I was giving them an apocalypse. I was uncovering something that was hidden to the kids so that they could see what it was. Okay. But another way of defining it, lost our screen. I think we've gone to our secondary screen. There we go. Okay. Another way of defining it, an apocalypse is a prophetic vision of heavenly secrets that can make sense of earthly realities. This is my favorite definition of an apocalypse because it gives the context of what it means when it's used in the Bible. Okay? When the word apocalypse is used in the Bible, this is really what it's talking about. It is a prophetic vision of heavenly secrets that can make sense of earthly realities. What do we mean by this? When we think about the world we live in today, when we think about what we experience as we go through life, sometimes it can be pretty confusing trying to understand how God is fulfilling his purpose, If we just look at the events of the world around us, it can be hard to make sense of where God is and how God is working. How is God working His purpose out? What apocalyptic prophecy does for us is it helps us to see the world we live in through the light of heaven and how it fits in with God's heavenly plan. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? I hope it does. That's what an apocalyptic prophecy is and means. It's used to refer to prophecies which reveal the future and how God will reunite the realities of His heavenly kingdom and the earth back into one. It's how God will reunite the realities of His heavenly kingdom and earth back into one. How is God fulfilling His promises to us? And why is this such an important concept to start off with and understand? There's a few different apocalyptic prophecies in the Bible. Matthew 24, you would say, is an apocalyptic prophecy. You would look at some parts of Zechariah and say that there's elements of apocalyptic prophecy in Zechariah and some other parts of the Bible. Maybe some parts of Isaiah as well, apocalyptic in their nature. Especially Isaiah 65 and 66. But Daniel and Revelation are unique because almost the whole books are apocalyptic in nature. The prophecies there they have are specifically apocalyptic. So it's really helpful for us to have a good definition of what apocalyptic means before we start really delving deep into Daniel, because it helps us to understand the purpose of the book and the prophecies that are contained. One of the biggest mistakes people make with apocalyptic prophecy is that they misunderstand the purpose of apocalyptic prophecy and they end up coming up with crazy interpretations. Okay? Crazy, far out interpretations because they misunderstand the purpose of apocalyptic prophecies. Help a vision of heavenly secrets that make sense of earthly reality. So when we look at Daniel himself, let's think about what was going on. Whenever we look at any Bible book, we should try to consider the background to the book. We should try to consider what's going on in the story behind the scenes so we can better understand what is going on in the story. So what is some of the stuff that we know of that was going on during the time of Daniel that can help us better understand what was being revealed to Daniel? Remember, when we're struggling to understand how reality is a fulfillment of God's promise, apocalyptic prophecies help us to understand it in a new light. So, Daniel lived during the time when Judah and Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, and the whole of Israel was taken into captivity. So really, to think about it, what happened? Their temple was destroyed, their cities were destroyed, and most of their people were taken away from their land. Before that time, they ruled themselves. They had kings that ruled their own country. They were independent. And all of that was shattered when the Babylonians and Nebuchadnezzar came through and defeated them 3 successive times. Okay? It wasn't just one campaign. There were 3 successive times he came and he laid siege to Jerusalem. And each time he eroded their freedoms. And the final time, they destroyed the temple and they completely took most of the people, the majority of the people, out of their land, but the ones that were left were not in charge or in control of it. Okay. This was a cataclysmic event for Daniel and his people. This was an absolute unmitigated disaster for them. It was the end of their nationhood at that point in time. So he lived during this time. So think of some of the really important things that we need to understand about how that Daniel and the Israelites would have been feeling during this period of time. What things help us understand their identity? I've got 3 things here to suggest. Click on the screen. There we go. So 3 things that help us understand what was going on in their identity as people of God during this period of time that Daniel wrote his book. First of all, remember, this helps us understand their identity. The people of Israel were promised the land of Canaan as their inheritance. Okay, remember? They were promised that land as their inheritance. Second thing to consider, they saw themselves as God's chosen people who practiced the correct worship of the true God of heaven. To them, there was no one else on earth, no other nation, no other people that practiced the true worship of the true God of heaven. They were the only ones. They were God's chosen people who practiced true worship. And where did they practice it? They practiced it in their temple. In many senses, many of their acts of worship that they were commanded to perform in Moses' books were impossible to perform without the temple. Okay? That's really important to understand. The temple and their place was essential to them being able to practice the true worship of the true God, and they were God's chosen people. The third point was that God had promised that all the peoples of earth would be blessed through them. All the peoples of earth would be blessed through them. This summarizes their identity as Israelites. These 3 things were essential to the identity of the people of Israel during Daniel's time. So, after they were taken into captivity, these 3 things, all of these 3 things were taken away from them. So Daniel and the people of Israel in Babylon, what had happened? What had happened to them? First thing, they were taken out of their land and the land was given to others. The second thing was they could no longer practice all the things God had told them to because their temple and its furniture and function were completely destroyed. They could not practice what God had told them to because everything was destroyed. Third thing was how, and you've got to put yourself in the mindset of the Israelites. God had said all people would be blessed through us, people of the earth would be blessed for us. How could that promise be fulfilled through a nation that no longer exists? Does that make sense? So for Daniel and his friends and all the Israelites sitting in Babylon, these were the things that they were going through at that point in time. It was deeply affecting their identity and their psyche because all these things had happened. They had been taken away from their land, it had been given to others, they couldn't practice their religion because their temple had been destroyed. And how on earth could God possibly fulfill his promise? Because we no longer even exist as a nation. And you would be wondering to yourself, if you were Daniel and God's people sitting in Babylon, you would be wondering to yourself, is that it? Has God left us? Has God completely given up on his plan to bless humanity? Is the whole of earth, is God's plan being laid to waste? Is God even there anymore? You would be asking these kinds of questions. These would be the things. You'd be wondering. I can't make sense of what's happening. This isn't the way we thought things were going to go. But Daniel and all the faithful Israelites who would have been in Babylon knew the reason why it had happened. They knew the reason why it had happened. Why had all of this happened to Israel? Well, because God told them very clearly in Deuteronomy the result of whether they obeyed God or disobeyed God. If they obeyed God, they would receive the blessings. And many of the blessings that God said would happen if they obeyed Him happened during the reign of Solomon. Many of those blessings were fulfilled during the reign of Solomon. Not all, but many. But what did they do? They continued to worship false gods. They continued to disobey God, and God sent prophets, He sent warnings. Time and time again, He kept sending these prophets and these warnings about the fact that they had been disobeying Him. And God told them in Deuteronomy what would happen if they continued to disobey Him. And ultimately, there would be curses that would be as a result. And the very things that happened to Israel when they were taken into captivity in Babylon matched exactly the curses God said they would receive in Deuteronomy if they disobeyed Him. So they just needed to know their scriptures to realise why this was going on. It was as a reason against God. They knew this. And Daniel and his friends knew this. So you can imagine what it would have been like for Daniel and his friends living in Babylon in exile, knowing that they had received the punishment God had given them. It would have been a time of deep reflection. It would have been a time of prayer and reflection and confession about what they had done as a nation. They knew why this all happened. And they would have been wondering, has God completely abandoned us? The question in their mind would have been, has God completely abandoned Israel? And if so, who then would God use as an example to the rest of the nations of the true worship of God? And how can God fulfill His promise to bless all the earth? How is God going to fulfill this promise? These are the things that would have been going through your mind as you were in Babylon, like Daniel. How is God going to turn this around? How can He possibly fulfill His promise to the Israelite people and the world about leading people to true worship of Him and fulfilling His promise to bless the world? When we understand this background, it helps us to better understand what it must have been like as a faithful Israelite in Daniel's time. And it helps us when we look at the book of Daniel to see that, remember, it's an apocalyptic prophecy. God is uncovering the spiritual realities of what is really happening to show Daniel that he had not abandoned his people, and that his plans would still be fulfilled regardless of the status which Israel enjoyed in an earthly sense. Remember, it is helping us to understand, it is revealing heavenly realities that help us better understand what's going on earth. It would have been hard for Daniel and his friends to understand what was going on earth and how God was fulfilling His promises, but the prophecies of Daniel are there to show them how God is going to fulfill these promises to them. So what we're going to be doing in the next couple of weeks is looking in more detail at the prophecies of Daniel. But as a little bit of a summary, we know Daniel is split into two main parts. There is chapters 1 to 6 and 7 to 12. Two main parts, and they kind of have two different purposes in a sense. Chapters 1 to 6 of Daniel tell the stories of Daniel and his friends. It tells the stories of their faithfulness to God, despite the fact that all God's blessings seems to have been stripped away from them, and that they couldn't practice all those things that God had told them to do. They were still faithful in whatever they could be faithful in. Does that make sense? They couldn't couldn't go to the temple and offer a sacrifice. They couldn't do that. They couldn't go and celebrate the festivals. How could they celebrate the festivals while they were in Babylon? It wasn't possible because they didn't have the temple and they couldn't offer the sacrifices. But what they did do is they were faithful in everything they could. So those stories in the beginning of Daniel 1-6, how does it show their faithfulness? You have the story where they were meant to be eating at the king's table. And people think that was about eating unclean meat, which it probably was a part of it. But remember, any meat that was on the king's table, what also would have happened to it? It would have been sacrificed to another god, right? So not only when you were eating that meat would they possibly be eating unclean meat, but also it would have been seen as an act of worship to the gods that those animals were sacrificed to as well. So why do they? You might say, like, is it possible that some of that meat was lamb? Was it possible that some of that meat was beef? They could have said, hey, we're allowed to eat this, but what do they say? No, we're going to be vegetarian. Why? Why did they take such a hard stance? They took a hard stance because it wasn't just an issue of unclean meat versus clean meat. It was also an issue of worship. And they said, we're not going to partake. They were willing to put their lives on the line for that. So you see them being faithful in that. Also, you see we obviously have the story of Daniel 2, which we will come back to. But we also have the story of Daniel 3, where there's the statue that is placed on the plain of Shinar, and they're told to bow down and worship it. Again, uncompromising. We can't go to the temple and perform these acts of worship for God, but we will not bow down to another God. We'll put our own lives on the line, we won't bow down. We have the story of Daniel and the lion's den. What was the issue there? He would pray 3 times a day. Where? Towards the temple. At the times, not only at the times of the morning and evening sacrifice, but he would pray another time as well. And so Daniel couldn't go to the temple to fulfill functions, but he would pray every day. Do you see? He was faithful in whatever he could be faithful in. He lived in a place where he couldn't perform all the things God had told him to perform, but whatever he could do, he did. And the same with his friends. And what happened every single time? Were their lives on the line? Every single time? Yep. They were uncompromising about it. And how did God treat them? God blessed them. Not only did God bless them, but God also witnessed to the pagan king, Nebuchadnezzar, that he was the true God. And God was fulfilling his purpose to the Israelites in them being an example to the world, true worship of God, because what happens in the end? Nebuchadnezzar becomes a follower, a worshipper of the true God. So that's Daniel 1-6. We also know that there is the story of the statue as well. Their life was on the line then, not through their own fault. But Daniel is faithful in saying, I'll pray to God. I trust in God that God will help me to understand. Give me some time, I'll pray to God. And God answers that. And through that statue, God shows that he is going to be, that when you look at that statue and what that statue represents different kingdoms that are going to come. Daniel chapters 7-12 are prophecies that are given to Daniel. Daniel's chapter 7-12 are prophecies, visions that are given to Daniel. But what they are doing is they're using a principle that we find in the Bible. We find it in Daniel and we find it in Revelation. We'll talk about this as we go through. It's called repetition and expansion. It's repetition and expansion. So the way I like to think of it is that what God does is He gives a big picture of God's purpose and what God is doing throughout history. He gives a big picture in Daniel chapter 2 because He gives that story of the statue. He doesn't give a great amount of detail. If you look at the interpretation of Daniel chapter 2, it's actually very short. The interpretation is very short. It's the head of gold is Babylon. The arms and chest of silver is another kingdom, and then the next one is another kingdom, and the fourth one is another kingdom, and then the legs of iron and clay is a little bit more detail, and then finally there is God's kingdom. It's not hugely detailed. Daniel chapter 2 is not detailed. Daniel's chapter 7 to 12 is essentially fleshing out Daniel chapter 2. Okay? But every time it's repetition and expansion. Because it tells the story, but it gives a bit more detail. And then what it does is it focuses in on a smaller part of it and expands it out and gives more detail again. So Daniel chapter 7 to 12 gives us more detail about what's going on in Daniel chapter 2. But what was God's ultimate purpose? Remember what was going on for the Israelites. The Israelites went, how is God going to fulfill His purpose? How is He going to fulfill His promises to Israel? How is He going to fulfill His promise to bless the whole world through the Israelites? How can that happen when we're in exile? But here's the interesting thing. When the Israelites came out of exile, did they ever become in charge of their own country again? Did they ever rule themselves again? Not really. They could argue that during the Hasmonean uprising, which was the Maccabees, that they controlled Israel for a very short period of time. They defeated their enemies. But that was very short. Really, they never really regained their former glory, did they? They never went back to being the way they were before the exile. They never had their kings. They never really worshipped. They never really ruled themselves as a nation anymore. And God knew that that was going to happen after they came out of exile. God saw Israel back as a nation, but they would never get back to those promises that God had given them. That might happen if they were faithful back in Deuteronomy. So He knew that they would be. How could this be happening? How can God fulfill His plans if we're not in charge of ourselves? Some people look at what happens in Daniel chapter 2 and then the expansion of that, chapter 7 to 12, and they'll say, Daniel is telling us what all the world's superpowers are going to be. Because you've got Babylon, you've got Medo-Persia, you've got Greece, you've got Rome, you've got the breakup of Rome. But you know what? It doesn't tell us about China. It doesn't tell us about Mongolia. Mongolia was probably the largest kingdom that ever existed on Earth. It doesn't tell us about the USA. It doesn't tell us about the USSR. It doesn't tell us about Russia. It doesn't tell us about modern China. Okay? You might go, well, it's not complete because it doesn't tell us all these things. But that would be misunderstanding the purpose of Daniel. Daniel was not trying to tell us all of world history and all the superpowers that would exist. Those superpowers that it's talking about relate to those powers that would have influence over God's people. Does that make sense? They would be the powers that would have influence over God's people. It wasn't all the powers all over the world all the time. It was those that would have influence and impact the people of God. And what was God basically saying by explaining all of this to Daniel? Is He was saying that on the surface, it may look like my promises are gone. It may look like my purpose is not being fulfilled, but I am still fulfilling my purpose. God is saying to Daniel and his friends, and He says to the rest of the world through those prophecies, that God has placed those powers over Israel. God has put those people in charge over Israel.
When the Persians are in control of you, don't think that I'm not working. Don't think my plan has been forgotten or unfulfilled. I am the one that gave them permission to have power over you. I put them in charge over you. I put Nebuchadnezzar in charge over you. I put the Medo-Persians in charge over you. I put the Greeks in charge over you. I even put the Romans in charge over you. By the time of Jesus, had they remembered that God actually put the Romans in charge over them? They'd forgotten that, hadn't they? They were so focused on kicking the Romans out. And we see at the heart of those last few chapters, Daniel's chapter 7 to 12, it shows us, it gives insight as to how God was going to fulfill his promises to his people. He gives the promise of the Messiah, and how God would use the Messiah to fulfill his promises for his people. So when we understand what was going on, the background to it, we can better understand the prophecies of Daniel and their purpose. And we always need to keep that in the background when we're reading through Daniel, so we can better understand the purpose of these prophecies. Next week, we're going to start looking into the prophetic message of Daniel and how we can use some of these principles to better understand them. And I hope that you enjoy as we start going in and diving deep into the prophecies of Daniel. And we'll be looking at that in more detail next week. But remember, when we're reading through it, we always need to understand what was going on for those that were going through it. What was the message God was giving to them through it? What were they going through? What was God? Apocalyptic prophecies? Is God, remember when we said, I'll go back to that definition, prophetic vision of heavenly secrets that make sense of earthly realities. Is that relevant to us today? In what we're going through? Do we need a prophetic vision that reveals heavenly secrets that make sense of our earthly realities? Absolutely. God has given it to us in his word. As we go through this series, we'll see how God is giving us that insight to better understand how he is still there and achieving his purposes today. And it will stop us from coming up with crazy interpretations when we better understand it. And we understand the purpose. So, we're going to finish with our last song. If you want to sit and enjoy that song, and then we'll have a prayer today. So, go to last time. Secure from all around, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how sweet to walk in this building, leaning on the everlasting arms. Oh, how bright the path grows from day to day, leaning on the everlasting arms. Leaning, safe and secure from all alarms. Leaning on the everlasting arms.
Let's be prayed. Dear God, we want to thank you that despite all the things that happen in this world, this world can sometimes seem confusing to us. That you know the end from the beginning, and that you never change. Your purposes are the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And that in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, whatever is happening around us, we can always lean on your everlasting arms. We can always look to you, and we thank you for the fact that your word gives us insight to the heavenly secrets that help us make sense of our earthly realities today. We pray that you would give us comfort and that you would give us confidence in you as we look into your word and we understand the purposes of what you're communicating to us through it. We pray this in your name. Amen. Thank you very much for today. Yes.